Hello, welcome back to Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders, and like I always say, go back and start at episode 1. This podcast has so much great content. You can see the whole journey if you go back, listen from the beginning. But first, listen to this great one with Stephan van Vliet, PhD, my pal. He came to Austin. He was in town working with the cattlemen, doing some tests on meat like he does. And we decided to do a round 2. It's been a few years. You can go back and listen to the first one with him. He was at Duke University back then. Now he's the director at the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State University. He's doing more of the same great research on metabolomics. He's looking at over 50,000 secondary compounds that are in foods and meat and figuring out what makes them healthy, why when you raise animals regeneratively, they get more of these compounds. These are things like flavonoids and all these phytonutrients that come through the animal into the meat and fat and give us good nutrition. So he's using mass spectrometry to look at those, some crazy stuff in the lab to prove why how you raise the animal matters, why it's better than feedlot beef, why it's better to have diverse rangelands that the cattle graze on and get more nutrients. Same thing with plants. He can see how if you raise plants regeneratively and do it well with the good practices, they'll get more nutrients. And now they're extending that to humans so they can see how it affects human health when you do practice as well. Very interesting stuff. You're going to love this episode. He's all on board with the sapien stuff, the diet and lifestyle. He really is on the cutting edge of the research that needs to be done. So check this one out and also support Nose to Tail because we do all these practices. My ranchers are amazing. They're here in Texas doing the regenerative practices, eating hundreds of species. These cows out there chowing down on all the good nutrients so we can get it through their meat and their fat. Nosetotale.org. Also the beef tallow body care, clean stuff. You want to put this stuff on your body, no chemicals, just beef tallow and a few simple ingredients. Also, join the Sapien organization. We have the waiting list. Go to sapien.org, put in your email there, and check out this episode with Stephan van Vliet, PhD. He's a legend. Enjoy this one. All right, we're live with Stephan van Vliet. How's it going?
Good, Brian. Yourself?
Oh, I'm great. Yeah, we're in person this time. You were on the show a couple of years ago. Did a great podcast. People can go back and listen to that one. I wish I had time to listen to it so I could refresh myself on all the great stuff we talked about. So maybe we'll overlap a little bit because people might not go back and listen. But tell us what you do with your research.
Yeah, so I'm the director of the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State University. And this is a clinical facility, so we do a lot of human subjects research, so randomized controlled trials, feeding people different foods, taking their blood, taking their urine, taking their stool, and then see what happens to their health. And related to that, we also have a food nutritional profiling arm of our work. So we oftentimes evaluate foods from conventional agriculture, from regenerative agriculture. We look what's in the foods in terms of micronutrients, macronutrients, as well as this large array of what we call the dark matter of nutrition, things such as polyphenols, flavonoids, peptides, etc. So we compare things grown regeneratively versus conventional and profile the foods, and then feed these to people in human nutrition trials to see if this has any impact on their health. And we've done studies with grass-fed and grain-fed beef, with crops grown regeneratively versus conventional, and evaluating those in the lab. So that's primarily the two main areas of research that we do.
This is amazing because everyone wants these studies. And I've been doing podcasts, well, only 6-7 years now, but people have been wanting this forever, really. Because us nutrition nerds, we've always wanted to just know, well, what are the actual outcomes? Like we theoretically, and it's pretty easy to figure out that it's going to be better, but we need to show the studies.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, a lot of these things you can sort of empirically observe, I guess, right? If you, for instance, take the example of cattle, when they're much like humans. They're just another mammal, right? If let's say one example I always like to use, let's say if you and I go to a buffet and we can select from 50 different foods, right? We will probably be better able to nourish ourselves as opposed to we're sat down and get a plate shoved in front of us. So, and this is typically something that we see. It's the ability to engage in innate behavior for cattle, to select from a wide variety of foods, a wide variety of plants, and as a result, they are typically healthier. And I, at least through our research, have convinced myself that a healthier animal is also a more nutritious piece of meat or milk. And the same kind of holds true for plants, right? Like if you go out in nature, you don't see a monoculture unless it's been created by humans. So even plants benefit from having other plants around. A little bit of competition is good. And so we see this with plant agriculture as well. If you grow plants together with a variety of other different plants, you see that this typically improves the health of the soil. And where do the plants get the nutrients from? Well, they also get it from through photosynthesis. But also a lot of these micronutrients, they come from the soil. So they get incorporated into the plant. So a healthier plant is a more nutritious plant because, let's face it, even though we like to think that, plants do not incorporate nutrients for us to eat, and neither do animals, right? I mean, we can obtain benefit from it, of course, but first and foremost, it's for their own health, or in the plant's case, to defend themselves against UV exposure, to water drought, through predation from herbivory, or maybe even attracting pollinators through fruit. So if you have a more colorful blueberry, right, as a blueberry plant, you're going to attract more pollinators, and this is beneficial for you. And what does that mean? It means you have to incorporate more of these anthocyanidins into your blueberry to attract these pollinators. And as a result, what we at least think, and what the research would suggest, is that if we then eat that blueberry, that this would result in more polyphenols for our body and potentially a health benefit. And the same thing with animal source foods. Having a healthier animal that, for instance, has more omega-3 fatty acids in the meat, this can translate into more omega-3 fatty acids in our blood.
Hey, it's Brian just jumping in to remind you to support nosetail.org. Support our regenerative ranchers. They're doing great things. We got some pork left. We got some beef. We also have the body care, the beef tallow body care, and the biltong. This is the best way to get meat on the go, grass-fed and finished. We also have the livervores. We have liver in the beef sticks. It's a great way to get some extra nutrients. I don't like to eat plain liver or cook it. I like it in the beef sticks. So that's livervores, very clean snack. Get it at nosetail.org. Thanks for your support.
I like how you phrase things like a true scientist. This is, our prevailing theory, and this is what the research suggests. And you can never know for sure. And we've been talking before, because we went out to dinner last night, and we need 30-year research to really understand this all, and it's impossible to really do.
Yeah, it is. I mean, in an ideal scenario, and this is what we're finding sort of in our research too, is that, in the short term, just taking people off of a standard American diet and giving them some whole foods, you probably improve your health 80%. You get 80% of the way there, right? And then those nuances that we talk about sometimes in terms of like, grass-fed beef contains more omega-3 fatty acids. Studies suggest or find that if you eat grass-fed beef, you see a shift in the omega-3 fatty acids, just higher amounts. If you do so for 30 years, this should, in theory, lower your risk of cardiovascular disease. But in a 3-month randomized controlled trial where we see these blood omega-3 fatty acids levels go up in grass-fed beef consumers, no one's going to develop heart disease in our study. And if they do, I got a whole lot of explaining to do to the IRB that if someone developed heart disease in that time period, right? So these are some of the nuances of it. But obviously you can find clues, and based on sort of the best evidence that you have, you try to form recommendations, but there's uncertainty in it because there's no actual study that would suggest, okay, eating this for 30 years lowers your risk of heart disease.
So we just have to admit we're never going to get that, and it's fine.
It's fine. Yeah, it's fine. I mean, it's research, right? There's nothing magical about it. It's just people doing science, and as fancy as they are, we're still limited in that, of course. And it's our interpretation of what we see, what we observe, right? As humans making observations, using at least rigorous controls that are accepted, and basing recommendations on that. But there's always going to be uncertainty of it. But if you look at sort of the pillars of research, it's typically, when do you start to feel comfortable about something? If in vitro studies, which are basically cell-based studies. So let's say if we throw a polyphenol on a cancer cell line and we see reduced growth of that cancer cell line, then if we give those polyphenols to rats in a cancer model and their tumors decrease, then if we feed polyphenols, for instance, from blueberries to people, and we see that maybe their inflammatory markers decrease, or we see markers of phenolic metabolism increase in their body. And then taking it, so this is the randomized controlled trials, which is something that in our group we primarily perform. And then if you go on to the epidemiological studies that find, higher blueberry intake is associated with a reduced risk of cancer, if all four point towards this benefit, then you can reasonably state, okay, we believe that blueberries or blueberry consumption could have beneficial effects and are associated with anti-cancer effects. And where it becomes tricky, and I think this is sort of the controversial part, is blueberries. I don't think a lot of people would question whether they are healthy or not, right? But when you go into something like red meat, the evidence becomes really murky because there seems to be this disconnect between red meat fed to people in randomized controlled trials versus epidemiological studies. Whereas if you feed red meat as part of a randomized controlled trial, as part of a healthy diet, and there have been studies like done about the Mediterranean diet, the BOLD diet, the MIND diet, the DASH diet. What's magic about these four diets? Nothing, but what do they have in common? They're whole foods based. And then you see typically improvements. But if you then go into society and look at how people are consuming red meat, it is not as part of, well, maybe you and I would consume it as part of whole foods diets, and maybe many of the listeners, but the vast majority of Americans will consume this as part of a standard American diet and through fast food outlets. And that's where I think a lot of the disconnect comes from.
This is what I want to shout from the rooftops. You know, we see people in the real world eating meat in a very unhealthy way, and then it always gets caught up in these epidemiological studies, and it looks bad. And I think there's sort of an agenda, even because we know that it's healthy. We've been eating it for all of history. It doesn't make sense that it's bad. It makes sense that these people who are eating it in the bad context of a bad diet.
Yeah, I 100% agree. But I don't know if there's like an agenda. I think, think of it this way, Brian. Let's say if you do 30 years of epidemiological research and all you see is red meat being associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of cancer, even increased risk of diabetes, which in my view, you have to really get creative to come up with mechanisms, right? Because I don't think eating meat is going to give you diabetes personally, because
it's kind of the way out of diabetes for a lot of people.
Yeah, it would appear so. Like at least within sort of the real world scenario. Yeah, for a lot of people that is the case, right? And so I think that's also why there's sort of this big pushback of like, well, epidemiological studies would suggest that red meat is associated with diabetes, but if I go on an animal-based diet, all my glucose markers improve, right? And I think this is the case. I mean, people would argue whether this is beneficial long-term and what about lipoprotein profiles, but I think it's safe to say that your glucose markers will rapidly improve because you're taking out a bunch of carbohydrates and probably are taking out sort of your refined carbohydrate intake as well, right? And this is another key point. But yeah, I mean, the mechanism that people often bring up is sort of inflammation, and that's this inflammatory response can cause sort of a diabetic phenotype. And I'm not per se necessarily disagreeing with that, but if you, with the point of inflammation, I do disagree with the part that red meat will cause diabetes. And in many of the randomized controlled trials, and this is a perfect example of a disconnect, meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials would suggest that meat consumption is neutral or can improve glycemic markers. But then epidemiological studies would suggest quite the opposite. And then you can argue, well, the studies are too short and et cetera. I mean, these are things, this is an often limitation of randomized controlled trials. And the same thing you'll say in epidemiological studies. It is rife with limitations, and it is what it is. But yeah, I think this is where also the confusion comes from.
Yeah, it makes sense, and I get it. But we have to look at all the lines of evidence. You basically laid out what we laid out in the Food Lies intro of we need to look at all the lines of evidence from clinical trials to the paleoanthropological data to, just human nutrition, what we know about biology. And when all those combine, it's really clear what we should eat. And it is just what we've eaten for all of history. It's like all organisms do best on the diet they evolved on. And this just makes perfect sense. And like cows co-evolved with grass, right? So this is what they're supposed to eat. And then the lions eat the zebras and the zebras eat the grass. Like this is just sort of obvious stuff, but for some reason there's a lot of confusion in the modern day. And like you said, it's because of that epidemiological data. It's like, I don't think anyone in the modern world, other than a few % of people, are eating a healthy diet in what humans should eat, right? I think that's the problem. If you're studying a population where, say, 97% of people are not eating well, like what are you going to find?
Yeah, that if you make them eat a little bit better, they get rapid improvements, right? So and yeah, this is sort of what we found now in 2 studies. Is in one study we gave people 4 weeks of an ultra-processed diet, and in line with what most Americans consume, which is about 2/3 of the calories coming from ultra-processed foods. And this is for people who are familiar with it, foods within the Nova 4 classification. You could argue that it has limitations, like anything in research has limitations. But typically what Nova 4 means, the simplest form is that foods that you and I cannot produce within our kitchen, right? So these are very highly refined pastries, cookies, breads, pizza, pasta, candy, Pop-Tarts, you name it. Those type of foods, right? People often like to put forward the argument, well, what about almond milk that has been fortified? That's Nova 4 and it can be healthy. And I agree, yes, it can. I would agree that this can be part of a healthy diet, but this is not what people are consuming, right? Like theoretically speaking, you could probably create a healthy diet out of that, but this is not how people are consuming it. But coming back to that, we fed for people 4 weeks of an ultra-processed diet, 4 weeks of a whole foods diet. We matched for macronutrients. So for protein, carbohydrates, fat, total fat, saturated fat, even for sugar. We had to get a little creative there. We had to give people on the whole foods diet honey to kind of match that. But anyway, we did see that people who were consuming the whole foods diet, they got healthier. Independent of calories, clearly, or macronutrients, because people that were on the standard American diet, well, we recruited people that were on the standard American diet, so they just remained as healthy or unhealthy as you'd like. But people that were switched over to whole foods diet, within 4 weeks, they dropped their triglyceride with like 30-40%. They dropped their glucose, their fasting insulin, their inflammatory markers improved, which is also quite amazing that you can eat like crap for 20 years and then you go on a healthy diet for 4 weeks or 8 weeks and you see things come into normal ranges again and people start dropping weight. So I think that's the fascinating part about mankind.
That's the power of real foods. Yeah. So it matched the macros, but did it restrict the calories or match the calories, or is that just to satiety, to ad libitum?
No, it matched the calories, and this was challenging to match the calories because what we found out very quickly after a few participants, if people went on the standard American diet first, they were complaining of being hungry and not satiated. So what we did with a few participants is like, we increased their caloric intake towards what would be maintenance, or we kept it at maintenance. But then those same people would then switch over to the whole foods diet, and all of a sudden they could not achieve 2,400 or 2,500 calories anymore. They could barely touch 2,000 calories. So when we figured that out, people on the standard American diet, they were not consuming as much as they would have liked to consume. And the only thing we didn't match was fiber, because we were like, do we want to, this would be pretty unnatural to give them like a psyllium husk supplement or something like that. So we didn't do that. So the fiber was about twice as high on the whole foods diet. But all the other macronutrients were matched. And so you could argue that there's something wrong with the standard American diet, irrespective of calories. So this if it fits your macros, I would argue, also too simplistic of a view. Your food quality does matter.
This is what I've been saying for years, and I guess we could bring up Lane Norton. He's a friend of mine now. We're all good. We had our little social media battles over the years, but he's just the if it fits your macros guy. And I think that this is a great study. I need to talk to him about it. Maybe have to do another podcast, but this is exactly what we've been saying the whole time. In the real world, what matters is what people actually do in satiety. So that, that helps them spontaneously reduce the like empty calories, basically, adds more than calories. I hate just talking about calories because this, if it fits your macros, it doesn't account for nutrients either, right? It doesn't account for so many things that happen in the real world. But this is the one study that actually did match for calories, and it did prove it out, because there's another Kevin Hall study that they just gave the processed diet and the whole food diet, and the whole food diet participants just ate like 500 less calories, right? Because they were full. They were naturally satiated.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I can't speak on behalf of Lane, though. I would argue, like, just following him, and I think he's a terrific guy and a great interpreter of the science. Though he may or may not argue that there's still benefits to eating some whole foods, right?
Oh, he does. No, that's
so,
what I'm saying. I'm not attacking Lane at all, because he's in Food Lies now, and we did a great interview with him, and he was talking about all the same points that I believe in, and that he definitely thinks people should eat more whole foods, and that, yeah,
because you start to get like, we figured out how to prevent micronutrient deficiencies, because if the ultra-processed foods were not fortified with B vitamins or zinc or iron, we would have the same rampant micronutrient deficiencies that we had 120 years ago when we had pellagra, we had beriberi, and a variety of micronutrient deficiencies. Well, how did we solve that? By fortifying our food supply. And it's very interesting. I'm teaching a course at the moment about advanced micronutrient metabolism to the students, and I like to talk a lot about the history, like how did we get here, right? And one of the things is that it was the refining of foods initially in the 17 and 1800s that caused these deficiency diseases, right? Because people were eating rice and beans for a long period of time. A classic example is of the Japanese sailors, like the naval fleet. They were eating brown rice as their ration for the longest time. No problems. But brown rice wouldn't keep as long. They started to polish the rice, and all of a sudden, people started to develop beriberi, which means weak. So they started to develop signs of weakness. And the interesting part is that the doctor who brought this up said, "Well, I think it has something to do with the white rice." And obviously, he was chastised and called a nutcase and ousted and things such as that, right? Because back in the day, everything was about infectious diseases, but he thought, well, this has nothing to do with infectious diseases. This has to do with a micronutrient deficiency, and it took a while for him to. He probably wasn't around for him to, to get reinstated. But and there's also a classic example that of the British sailors is that a physician brought this up already in like the 1700s, and guess how long it took before the rations became fortified?
A long time.
Yeah, you were going to say 100 years? Yeah, about that, right? Yeah, so for 100 years, this guy was called nuts, and he obviously wasn't around for it anymore, but this tells you that making these switches do take a long time, and I often tell the students is that, like a concept that may seem a little strange now might be accepted at some point as well, right? So we have to keep an open mind in science in that regard. And I think we kind of know that eating a bunch of ultra-processed food is not good for us. Yes, we don't have micronutrient deficiencies because we fortify them, but we're also not getting this depth of nutrients that we get from a whole food source, which probably contains like 40, 50,000 compounds that are maybe not, you don't develop a deficiency disease, but they do impact metabolism. And we don't have deficiency diseases anymore, but we do have metabolic diseases. And maybe those nutrients, those peptides, those polyphenols, those flavonoids are not essential for our health, but it does seem that they can impact our metabolism. And as a result, I believe our metabolic disease risk.
Well, now the majority of people have metabolic disease. So something's going wrong. We know that. And this makes perfect sense. The new theme of the podcast is you can't cheat nature. That's kind of my new thing with Sapien in general, right? It's that all of things that go wrong in society are, not all, you never say all, are probably because we went away from nature, right? Even with loneliness and depression, it's like, well, we used to live in tribes of people and be together and support each other and have close-knit communities. And even in Japan, these centenarians, they were living together. You know, they had a sense of purpose. They had support. Of course, they lived long. They're eating whole foods. They're doing so many good things. So they're living close to nature, close to how we should have always lived. When you go away from that, things go haywire. And of course, food is such an important one. And it's like, I think it's kind of 80% of it. You know, it's always like that 80-20 rule, right? It's like the food, maybe not 80, but even you're saying like getting 80% of the results just by going to a whole food diet. That makes sense to me because food is so powerful. And if you start messing with it, processing it down, you strip it down and add nutrients back in with fortification, there's unintended consequences. This is not right. This is messing with nature.
Yeah, you took something that's very complex and you simplified it, right? And because we think of like meat, for instance, as protein, and I hate the term protein because protein is a macronutrient and it does not do justice to the food. So I've been trying to, and I must admit, when we published a paper in 2015, we called it the skeletal muscle anabolic response to plant and animal protein. If I could change that title right now, I would say protein-rich animal foods and plant foods because it's not just protein, right? Protein. So I like to refer to as maybe protein-rich foods. Because it's a food. I mean, it's and you're getting a plethora of other nutrients with it. The most common one, of course, are B vitamins, as well as in many cases vitamin A as well. But my point being is that these food sources are so complex that if you eat meat, the meat metabolome, which is basically a fancy word of saying all the metabolites that are in meat, and many of these metabolites can serve as nutrients to us. Right? These are produced through the metabolism of the animal or the bacteria within the animal, specifically within the rumen. But these metabolites can serve as nutrients for us, but it's estimated that maybe the meat metabolome contains 40,000 of these metabolites. So then to think is like in sort of the crude scenario that we replace this protein or meat with just amino acids and a handful of B vitamins, then you've narrowed this 50,000 down to maybe like 30 nutrients, right? And you think you will have captured the key nutrients, but yeah, you have not. And what all is in meat, I don't know. But it is very complex, and it is likely that that's complexity, even though we don't understand it, it's likely that there are some benefits to that complexity.
Very likely. Yeah, this is just common sense. And this is why you can't just grow meat in a lab and think just because it has the same macronutrients and it has these large, scale vitamins, like you could just say a few B vitamins or A vitamins, and okay, we've matched for that. But there's up to 50,000 other ones that we don't even know about.
Yeah, and I'm skeptical too that you're able to replicate that because the food that you've grown or that cell line that you've grown will most likely just reflect the complexity of what you put in it, right? And that is true to a large extent for a cow as well, is the complexity that you put in it. And this is, like a little segue in what we're finding. If an animal is out on a pasture and it can access 200 plants, that meat looks a whole lot more complex than maybe when the animal has only access to 3 plants, for instance. So this plant diversity piece is very key. And we see this in cattle, but you see this even more so in wild ruminants, just because of, we have done some work with deer, also with bison, which are granted they're domesticated. But what you see, especially in deer, is that they browse a lot of those phytoeconomically rich plants, the shrubs, forbs, wildflowers in general, and yeah, they're even 5 times richer in these phenolic metabolites than beef.
It's good someone's doing this research. I think this is super important because we haven't had this data before. It's kind of obvious where people say, oh, well, it's better to eat this wild game and there's so many nutrients in it, and you just kind of knew it, or people just say it tasted better. But now you're out there doing it. So you're even doing the research and looking at the difference between, say, an animal, a cow, raised regeneratively compared to on a monoculture. So even if it's grass finished, it's still different if it's just sitting on a monoculture of grass compared to something that's regeneratively, holistically managed, moved around, diverse species, triple-digit amounts of forages?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the extreme scenario, we're about to publish a paper. It's in sort of the final revisions. I need to get a little bit more information about the feedlot diet. But this was from a rancher up in Idaho, Alder Spring Ranch, and we profiled their beef, and they're raised on these mountain pastures, and they're amongst the most phytochemically rich, probably because we've monkeyed with them. As humans, we haven't really monkeyed with them, right? So because you can't really grow anything else on there, and it's rough land, and they had access to about 1,000 plants or so, and yeah, that meat is incredibly phytochemically rich. And the interesting part of that is that these phytochemicals, these are also flavor compounds. Like in the book of Mark Schatzker, he has a book about the best steak in the world. And that steak from Alder Spring Ranch was one of the best steaks that he would consider. And because of the flavorfulness and the tenderness. And then when we test that meat, yeah, we can see that this meat is incredibly complex as well. And I must admit, I ate some of that meat that we tested as well. And it probably was one of the best steaks I've ever had too.
Yeah, we do that in Nose to Tail. I hate to plug my own company, but we do, my ranchers, the grandpa figured out regenerative ag 30 years ago. He took Alan Savory's course before anyone knew who Alan Savory was. And so they're out here in Texas, and they have tons and tons of species. And it just tastes different. Like, I can't explain it. It doesn't taste like grassy and weird. Like that could be depending on the seasons, or, there's different things going on with it. It just tasted rich, and it's just a different flavor.
Yeah, and from there on, you can also argue is that this again, not knowing exactly how it works, but I always like to draw parallels from animal research, or I should say non-human animals, because I think we know a whole lot more about feeding animals than we know about feeding ourselves, right? Is that you see this in classical studies, especially in livestock. If livestock eats a diverse and phytochemically rich diet, they tend to eat less. They do not tend to overeat. So it's satiating, it's nourishing, and in humans we don't really have very good studies on this. But one of the theories or hypotheses is that because we consume a standard American diet, it's not as satiating, right? And this could have a variety of reasons. It's digested and absorbed much more quickly. We don't have the fiber, but it could also be that it's just not as nourishing. We don't get this wide range of secondary metabolites, which typically are called antioxidants. The secondary metabolites, in the layman's term, they're antioxidants. So when you see that, you're talking about those compounds that come from the plants that are incorporated into the meat. It results in this complexity, this antioxidant or phytochemical complexity. And it could indeed be that this is more nourishing, this is more satiating. And people have done studies on that. I was at a conference earlier this year, and it was interesting because it was Mark Schatzker and I. It was kind of interesting because Mark Schatzker and I were having this roundtable discussion, and we kept talking about the phytochemical richness and the complexity of meat and milk, and how this is satiating, and the hypothesis that this results in maybe being satiated with less. Right? Like you can maybe eat a 4-ounce steak and be very satiated, as opposed to eating a 6-ounce steak that is less complex. And but then there was a professor talking after that, and to his point, I think he had it right. He said Americans like bland taste, and if we have bland taste, we will eat more of that. So he was working on sort of grass-fed milk, which can be very complex, and this is something I think the Europeans particularly appreciate. But his point is that why do people like Coke? They like Coke because it has an intense flavor up front, but it doesn't have an aftertaste. And because it doesn't have that aftertaste, you're more likely to take another sip very shortly after that. So if you can replicate that in something like grass-fed milk, people are more likely to drink grass-fed milk. More of it, should I say, which is economically beneficial. But Mark and I were arguing against that because we were like, well, we want this satiating feeling, right? Like this nourishment. And from an economical standpoint, I could see how drinking a quart of milk is more beneficial than half a quart of milk. But from our perspective, it was, well, if we feed animals well and we get this phytochemical richness in, we can maybe be satisfied with less. So we're less likely to overeat as well.
Well, this is where the incentives are misaligned, and that's just our current system. And actually, we talked about at dinner, if we had a magic wand, what would we do to change the world? And I said to align incentives where people were incentivized, or companies were incentivized to make people healthy. So it's never going to happen, I don't think. But if they were incentivized to make something more nutrient dense, we would eat less of it. But so they would sell less of it, and so it wouldn't work. But if there was some way to make it that way, then people, I think, would be a lot healthier on the world scale.
Yeah, I do think maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic, because I do think that with sort of regenerative agriculture, or in science we refer to as agroecology, which is basically mimicking nature, so nature-based systems or approaches to farming. Maybe your blueberry or your rice that is grown regeneratively doesn't have the same yield, but you can also command a premium on that. Mm-hmm. So at least from that perspective, the economics may work out to an extent. But I do agree that with your assessment that in general, yes, I mean, selling more of something, and especially the marketable and ultra-processed foods, yeah, it does incentivize that, as opposed to probably this tiny little profit margin that is on a blueberry or a piece of meat.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, that's what I always say. Selling meat's a great way to not make money. There's no money in whole foods. The profit margin in processed foods runs the world. But the problem is, if it was a bit more expensive, then only people would not afford it, right? So there's only certain people. So the healthier people would be the ones that spend more money. Then there's so many aspects to this, right? It's like before, we used to spend a lot more of our budget on food. And in European countries where they're healthier, they do still spend a lot more of their money on food. But in the US, you just want something as cheap as possible.
Yeah, indeed. And it is interesting, because we do, spend a lot of money on an iPhone, but then not on food, right? And or on cars or other consumables that really probably don't make us much healthier, happier even, right?
I think that's going away from nature too, right? We've been programmed through marketing to think that we need a brand new car. We just drove here in my old car. I love my old car. It's a good car. So I don't, I've gotten out of that programming where I don't need to buy a new car every few years. And yeah, it's just going away from nature once again, right? It's just...
Yeah, but it is hard, because, this sort of idea of elitism, I think, is rifled throughout our history, right? It still be like the priests that say, if you give me these gifts or we make these sacrifices, the rain will come. And then at some point people figure out, the rain's not coming, and let's get rid of the aristocrats and start over again. But my point is that, yeah, this idea of like status and wealth and this pursuit of that, I think, is very much also wired within the human brain. So it is hard. But then, on the other hand, if you can sort of take this out of like, or get sort of those, that satisfaction or that fulfillment from community, right? And I think that's so important. This is also the case. I was watching the Netflix series, the Blue Zones that came out, I think. Last year or this year, and it was very well made. But one thing I took away from that is that this community aspect that you cannot touch, right? Like it's not tangible. So, but it's probably, maybe it's just as important as the foods that we eat. It's just being around like-minded people, and this is probably one of the reasons why people in the blue zones get so old, because there's this strong community. But yeah, putting this in like hard numbers is very hard.
I think absolutely. And the Blue Zones it's kind of a story of a guy with an agenda, that he has this idea that a vegetarian diet is the best, and then he went around the world and proved that bias. And so I think you're completely right that they do so many other good things, and they're eating whole foods. That's what it shows. Shows that community, these people are working in gardens till they're 100. They are moving, they are outdoors, they have whole food diets. Everything about it is what is keeping them alive to 100, and not their macros of their diet or their plant to animal ratio. That's probably the least important part.
Yeah, I agree. And it certainly appears that there's plant-heavy diets, but there's also incorporation of animal source foods too. And I agree in the documentary that's not really displayed, because it's kind of like, I remember this. It was in Costa Rica, and you had this ranch who was like, I don't know, 80 or something like that, right? And
raising cows.
Yeah. Why do you think he raises? It doesn't keep them as pets, right? And the same with the guy in Sardinia that herds his goats and sheep around the mountain pastures. Yeah. Why did they do that? Not for fun or because of the physical activity, because they can collect the dairy and make cheeses out of it or consume it as yogurt and things such as that. So, which I guess, yeah, if you had a slight point of critique, that was maybe not per se highlighted as much. And if you do look at sort of the literature, it does appear that there's certainly these people are not on carnivore diets, but they do incorporate animal source foods alongside this wide plethora of whole foods.
That's the sapient framework to me. It's that humans around the world and throughout history have always got a foundation of animal nutrition somewhere, and usually to the extent at which they could, they sort of maximize their animal foods that they could acquire in their environment, and then filled it up with whole foods. And there's very many ratios and different times of the year, different times of what's going on in nature. And yeah, of course, that's always changed, but there's always been this foundation of animal nutrition and whole foods on the side. And it's kind of one of those things where you're talking about all the lines of evidence. It's like, this is just simple. Human nutrition. We know that animal foods are bioavailable and complete, have way more these proteins and amino acids that we need in the best form that we can use them. So it's very obvious when you put it all together. Okay, we know this, we know that. The only thing that doesn't line up is that weird epidemiology part.
Yeah, and I would argue that the epidemiology lines up too, because if you look at studies on where people consume animal source foods based as part of whole foods diets, which are not very common, but when people do that, typically the effects or the associations with disease risk oftentimes become neutral, and you have a few like very paradoxical studies. If you would ask the average person, do you think processed meat is associated with increased heart disease? People would say yes, everyone knows this. And then you have some interesting studies out of the Middle East that show quite the opposite, that processed red meat is associated with a decreased risk of metabolic disease. Why? Because people are consuming, their idea of processed meat is meat that is maybe sausage cured traditionally with spices or cooked as part of very traditional recipes, right? Which is a lot different from a Jimmy Dean sausage, of course, right? So processed meat isn't processed meat isn't processed meat. And in this case, eating processed meat is protective for, there's an interesting meta-analysis of studies out of North Africa and then the Middle East that finds this association with decreased risk of metabolic disease. And then there's also other studies in more Western populations that if you heavily account for diet quality, the risk is oftentimes, it never goes up. It always comes down, the risk, and oftentimes becomes neutral.
Well, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I always say that processed meat, it's like, well, also what are people eating with this processed meat too? There's way more of association of people eating these cheap sugar bad buns and a hot dog, right?
Yeah, and to even put it further, there is a study that came out, I think 1 or 2 years ago, and what the authors did was this was done out of Italy, I believe. They took pigs and they made a traditional Parma ham out of it, cured it for 12 months, or they took the easy way out and cured it for 4 weeks using a bunch of nitrates to do that, right? And when they fed people this traditional ham versus the quote-unquote what they call industrial ham, people that were eating traditional ham, they had improvements in inflammatory markers compared to people eating the modern ham. But what we oftentimes do in studies and even in recommendations from from organizations is that we combine processed meat in this whole lump of things. But I have a hard time believing that meat cured for 12 months with just salt is the same as a sausage that has 20 ingredients on there and was cured industrially in 4 weeks. I mean, the idea that the health effects of those are the same is, in my viewpoint, very unlikely. And some studies would suggest that this is the case. And why do I think it's unlikely? Because there's studies, and also just applying common sense, you think like, this is it's likely a little bit different.
Yeah, actually, we do that too with nose to tail. Man, I never talk about my own products, but no, like biltong is from South Africa, and they do it the natural way, and they air dry it for a week, and they use vinegar and spices only. And instead of beef jerky in America, they use nitrates, and they dehydrate it very quickly, and then they add sugar as well. So it's like they're very different products, but they just both come in a bag, and people just think they're the same.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I don't have any issues. Otherwise, I wouldn't eat it. But I have no issues eating like a ham that's cured for 12 months. It's delicious.
It's a natural way.
And, yeah, exactly. It's food preservation, indeed. And yeah, I mean, I think so. It comes back to the fact that we even took meat now, right, and made sort of an ultra-processed version of that, and it's no wonder that is associated with metabolic disease.
We should get back to Mark Schatzker, and I love the nutrient density part, the satiety part, even the nutrient leverage. So I don't think this has really been studied much, but Dr. David Robbenheimer and Simpson and Stephen Simpson, I had them on the podcast very recently, and they studied the protein leverage hypothesis, right? So they're saying that all animals eat to a certain amount of protein, all that they've studied, and there's tons and tons of studies. And then that's when they stop eating because they get their protein requirements. And if you dilute that from the food, basically eating processed foods, people eat more of it to get the same amount of protein. And they could even do studies to see, the people with the processed foods, they still got the 80 grams or whatever it was because they need, but they got more calories, more empty calories along with that protein. So I think that extends to the nutrients too. And Mark Schatzker, he wrote The Dorito Effect. He wrote the book about finding the perfect steak. He also wrote The End of Craving. So I've interviewed him twice already and talked about all these things. And I think we're all in agreement of this is what's going on, right? And I wish people would study more nutrient leverage, which sounds like kind of what you're doing, right? It's like if you eat, your body wants to get these nutrients. And we do have animal instincts. We can bring in Fred Provenza as well, that is sort of a mentor to you, and we know him, and he was on the show as well, is that we have these instincts, and we eat to acquire these nutrients, and maybe there are 50,000 secondary compounds we don't even know about yet, and then we are full sooner, our body's satiated when we get those from the food. And if you start messing with them, we're getting less of them, so we have to eat more. Does this kind of explain what's going on in the world?
I think it's part of the explanation. Yeah. I think it's part of I mean, there's never one silver bullet, but I think it plays into that why we overeat. And I would extend the protein leverage hypothesis to say sort of a essential nutrient leverage hypothesis, or even maybe even a non-essential nutrient hypothesis, where you get, because we know that these secondary metabolites, these antioxidants, they do, and we call them antioxidants. Think of it as like vitamins, and for instance, those are primary nutrients. We call them primary because they, if we don't consume them, we get deficiency issues. Mm-hmm. If we don't consume polyphenols, flavonoids, and a bunch of other, maybe non-essential amino acids, we won't die. We won't get deficiency diseases, but I also don't think we're optimizing our health. And what you do see is that if you provide these nutrients in a cell line, our metabolism does respond to them. So that clearly they have an impact. They're not just waste products. And we call them secondary in the past because, and they're still called secondary because we didn't know what they did. For the longest time, they were considered waste products of the plant. Mm-hmm. But the plant, nature rarely wastes anything, so they're not waste products. They're there for the plant to protect themselves, or to attract herbivory, or protect themselves from drought, sunlight, etc. And they impact metabolism, and they impact our metabolism too, because we've been consuming them for a long period of time, probably longer than meat, because we once started out as eating a bunch of fruit, right? So But my point being is that, yeah, that certainly, I think, is part of the explanation. And it's not so much that we, like, I guess, you can't do it all, that we systematically study this, because you could study this, for instance, in animal models, and people have definitely done that with withdrawal of certain nutrients, and animals would eat more to get those nutrients. So even if you withdraw, let's say you reduce a certain vitamin from their food, they would eat more of that ration until they meet that vitamin requirement as well. So kind of the same with protein. But we definitely observe this in our trials, that people would like to overeat if they're not adequately satiated or adequately nourished with nutrients, and that when they are, they want to eat less and sort of naturally lose weight because they're like, I'm satisfied. Yeah.
That's it. It's so obvious. It's just like, this is how we ate for all of history, and we eat from our natural environment, and it works out. No human in history had to count calories. It's so simple. And I don't want to say there's a silver bullet that explains everything, but this kind of is my version of the theory of everything, is that if you just look at, what we did for most of history, that's what we should do. And we've gone away from that.
Yeah, and I agree, because we've made nutrition science very complicated, but it is quite simple, right? Because if you eat whole foods, and the interesting part about humans is that, and I think this is what makes us so resilient, is that you can find people that have lived for years on a carnivore diet and be in what appears relatively good health, and you can find people that have been years on a plant-exclusive diet, on a vegan diet, and also are in relatively good health and can do so for a long period of time. Now, most of us, I would argue, operate best on the spectrum of omnivory, including various ratios of both, and it might depend on our lifestyle or our life stage that we're in. So I think eating healthy is not that complicated. It's actually quite simple, but we made it super hard for ourselves because of, I think, the environment that we're in, right? Like it's social determinants of health, food accessibility. We go out and there's, well, I mean, where we were last night in Austin, there wasn't, but we could probably drive out a little further and have these endless strips of fast food outlets, right? So it's really hard also for humanity to resist that. So we've made it really, I think eating healthy is very simple in a sort of a basic manner, but we made it very hard for ourselves to do so.
Oh, I agree. I think half of it is the implementation, and you have to change your relationship with food. You have to change the people you hang out with. You have to change everything about your life to be healthy and make the right choices. You can have all the right information and still make the wrong choices. So it's hard. So it's straightforward, but it's not easy. So yeah, it's simple theoretically, but maybe hard to execute.
Hard to execute. And I think you need to find something, like a reason to do so. If it's like, exercise or something like that, at least for me, that has always worked, because I like to exercise. I want to, feel good in the gym, have good performance. So therefore, this is for me a motivation to eat healthy, right? And if maybe I didn't care, then and maybe wouldn't, if I didn't care about like my physical appearance or things such as that, right? So this has been, but even if it's another reason for, like, I don't know, you want to see your grandkids grow old or something like that, right? Yeah. It's finding that reason, sort of that fire inside of you that wants you to be healthy and to make that switch. And then also sort of like, just don't buy ultra processed foods. Don't walk through those aisles. Don't put it in your cart, right? Because if I have cookies or candy in my house, then I'm gonna eat it. It's just how simple it is.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you change your habits. Now I just have no interest in it. I went out to a restaurant with you for the second time in 4 months. It's just not part of my life anymore. It's not that it's the end of the world to go to a restaurant, and I don't think everyone needs to do what I do. But it's just I've changed my thinking, and I just would rather cook my own food. And I should ask you, what do you eat, like, just generally? Like, what is the diet that you've landed on generally?
So obviously whole foods.
Yeah.
So, but no, I most of my meals. So I eat 3 meals a day, and most of my or all of my meals are just meat and veggies or fish and veggies or some sort of iteration on that. For me, a typical day might look something like this. In the morning, I made some eggs with liverwurst, with some greens and some stir-fried onions and peppers with milk. Usually a glass of milk. I'm a pretty avid milk consumer.
Raw milk, right?
Raw milk, yeah. I call it usually
yeah.
fresh milk because it's like, it has less of a now I gave it away as a nutrition professor drinking raw milk. But this is how I grew up indeed drinking it. So, and we have a very different view on this in Europe. In fact, an interesting side way to sort of understand it, because people will probably think this guy's nuts drinking raw milk as a...
Oh, everyone listening to my podcast drinks raw milk.
Yeah, okay. So, but here's the interesting part, and then we'll go on to lunch. In the Netherlands, for instance, and in many European countries, if you buy Gouda here, in the Netherlands, in order to label it Gouda and farmer's Gouda, it cannot be pasteurized. It has to come from animals out on pasture, and it has to be processed in a certain way. So it has to be raw milk, cheese from animals out on grass. Then you can label it Gouda, formally in the Netherlands. So, and pasteurization, you can't label it like that anymore. It's a different product. So we have this rich culture that sort of cultivates that.
And healthier than Americans.
Healthier, yes. Yeah, although we are there's 20 years behind the US. We have the ultra processed thing coming in too. But yeah, so it's... And then for lunch, it's usually some meat that I cooked. I usually prep everything in advance. So I cook like a bunch of vegetables. I cook a bunch of meat or fish in advance. So I might have some beef roast with some veggies, and then usually some yogurt that I make myself out of the raw milk with some fruit. And then at night, also again, some fish or some meat with some vegetables. And on days that I work out, so this is 4 days a week, I typically include more carbohydrates around my workout. And this is typically sourdough or potatoes or sweet potatoes are things that I eat. But I must admit, I do consume a lot of plant foods as well. I consume about a pound of vegetables with every meal 3 times a day, and then also 1 piece of fruit. But I'm also physically active. So I always jokingly say that I'm on a plant-based diet.
Well, we should do the calories. I want to know the calories, because maybe in volume it's plant-based, but calorically it might be animal-based.
Yeah, probably.
Right?
Yeah, no, it certainly is, because
you're using real fat. You're using yogurts. Like these are
drinking a bunch of whole milk, right? So this gives you a high amount of fat from that. So yes, by volume, definitely plant-based, but by calories, it's probably going to be maybe closer to 50-50. I've never calculated it, but or maybe even higher than that. I'm not sure. I think it's probably 50-50, because if I eat like about 180 grams of protein a day, and maybe like 60-70% comes from animal source foods, or 75%, so that's maybe like 800 calories, and then another maybe 800 calories from fat. That's like 1,700 calories, and the rest is, and I eat about 3,000 or so. So that's, doing the math, it's probably around 50-50 or so, because eating some sourdough bread or eating some potatoes, right? This
it ups it.
And fruit, ups it for sure, and some nuts and things such as that.
Well, it's sapient diet right there. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I'm not concerned if people like exactly by calories it has to be animal-based or not. You're eating a whole foods diet. It sounds amazing. This is sort of a Weston Price style diet, right? This is just traditionally processed whole foods and animal-based nutrition, and it sounds amazing. And I mean, you're looking healthy, and this is kind of what you do for a living, so it makes sense.
Yeah, I'm also a consumer, right? Like as a scientist, you have to stay objective, but it's hard I mean, say you should keep sort of your work separate from your daily life, right? It's not like it becomes tricky if you become sort of evangelical about it. And if you're very dogmatic about it, there's this risk that it starts to enter your work as well, where you maybe convince yourself that, if you're on the extreme opposite side of things, where eating a plant food is the worst thing ever, or eating eating a piece of meat is the worst thing ever and absolutely incompatible with health, right? So you have to be careful for that. But of course, if we're doing a lot of research on pasture-raised meat, a lot of research on organic or regenerative produce. Yeah, if we're studying that, and I get excited about that too, because this is why I want to study it, and why many of the students want to study it too. Yeah, but you inform your own diet with it, of course. Like if we find that this, milk has it's rich in these phytochemicals. And then actually, I studied the milk that I drank myself, and I was kind of interested in it. And I coupled it back to the farmer. Yeah, it had a very good omega-6 to 3 ratio. It was rich in phytochemicals. Not surprisingly, because you can taste it. So, of course, you have that inform your own diet as well. Because a lot of these things, I always jokingly say, is like, I really want to know it, and it's great that other people want to know it as well, so that we have funding for it.
You get to do research that you actually care about. We need to go into your research, because I realized we kind of skipped over it a little bit of what you exactly do. Maybe people can go back to episode 1 we did with you years ago, but you do metabolomics. You're using mass spectrometry. Like, you are looking at these tens of thousands of secondary compounds. So explain that more.
Yeah, so metabolomics is the study of metabolites, and metabolites are products of metabolism, whether it's a plant or an animal. And many of these metabolites can serve as nutrients for us. So not all metabolites are nutrients, but all nutrients are certainly metabolites. So if a plant produces polyphenols or produces vitamins or something like that, or you have microbial fermentation within the animal and produces certain fatty acids, we can obtain nutrients from that, clearly, by eating animal source foods or plant source foods. So what we do, indeed, we do profiling using mass spec, various mass specs, and you know, depending on what you want to study for minerals, you might use something different than for vitamins, and fatty acids, you might use something different again. But these are instrumentation that would also, for instance, be used in drug testing of athletes. You can look at very specific compounds, very small compounds, in a rather precise way. I'm simplifying it because it's quite complicated, actually, that you can do it, and some compounds are very similar to each other. But anyway, you can look at a large number of these compounds, and then what we typically do, we might have the example of, like, we study oats that were grown regeneratively and oats growing conventionally. We run them through the mass spec. We look at a large number of plant secondary metabolites as well as vitamins and minerals, and then we may or may not come to the conclusion that these oats grown, and this is typically what we find, but that these oats grown regeneratively incorporate more of these antioxidants. And then on paper, these oats would be healthier to consume for us.
This is another big piece of research we need. And so I was just thinking about, some of these carnivore guys out there, friends of mine, right? But I still don't really agree with them. But I'll see what you have to say. Is that they'll say, oh, well, we don't want these flavonoids or these polyphenols or these antioxidants, or they're irritating, or they're going to provide some sort of damage to us, and that they're not really necessary. Whatever that argument is, what do you say?
Yeah, it's very hard for me to agree with that. Here's what let me first and foremost say. I'm not denying the fact that if people have some sort of autoimmune disorder or have trouble eating plant foods, that maybe there's a certain benefit to withdraw these from the diet temporarily. If you have like leaky gut or something else, you just cannot digest it. Now, I would argue that if you have trouble digesting some sauerkraut or maybe some fruit or some vegetables, that you have some underlying issues, right? That need to be fixed, and then maybe you can incorporate these. But if I look at the literature, it's very hard for me to agree with that, because if we provide a polyphenol to a cancer cell, reduce cancer growth. We give this to a pancreatic beta cell, you see improvements in insulin metabolism. You give this to a variety of other cells, like a muscle cell or a liver cell, has an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory response. Then you feed these in high amounts to lab animals, which is sort of the second stage of research. You see health benefits. You see these things even appearing in the brain and impacting our cognitive function, impacting our blood flow beneficially, having anti-inflammatory effects to the tissues within these animals. Then we give these to people. Let's say we're eating a bunch of polyphenol-rich foods. In people, we see markers such as hyporic acid go up, which can be an antioxidant. You see other compounds go up that have potentially antioxidant effects. You see biomarkers of health improve. And then epidemiological studies, as randomized controlled trials, have similar limitations as epidemiological studies. One is not better than the other, don't get me wrong. Epidemiological studies would suggest that people that eat fruits and vegetables are healthier. And I know people will say, well, yeah, it's because they do 1,000 other things. And I 100% agree with that. But every research area has limitations. But all these 4 research areas point collectively towards the idea that eating flavonoids and having polyphenols in your diet from whole foods have benefits. So for me, not having those in your diet, they're non-essential, so you're not going to drop that. But over time, not having them in your diet, I think you're leaving benefits on the table.
Yeah, I'm there because that's how we evolved. Is we were getting roots and berries and herbs. It's like and whatever we collected these along with our meat.
Spices,
spices. It makes sense. I stopped getting sick once I started eating more nutrient dense diet. I mean, actually, when I just ate more meat, ate more animal foods, and lost the breads and the pastas, so I really upped my nutrient density. But then, so yes, I feel better. And then you have people who get sick all the time, and they're like, oh well, it fits my macros, and I'm look skinny enough. But I'm like, well, there's more to health than just that. It's like your immune system can work better if you're getting all these secondary compounds. We just don't know how they work, but it just seems pretty obvious that if you have them all, that you work better.
Yeah. And there's the interesting part about that too, Brian, is that if you're eating meat from grass-fed, if you're really against polyphenols or flavonoids, you should not be eating meat from grass-fed animals because they incorporate them. And granted, these are probably further downstream metabolites. Let's say a major phenolic compound is our benzoic acid and cinnamic acid. Cinnamon rich in cinnamic acid. That's what it's called after. You have benzoic acid is another one. Within the animal, and this is an antioxidant of itself, rich in plants, but you often see that these things become metabolized and they're altered. But the compounds that you see in plants, you also still see in animals. And if you consume higher amounts of grass-fed beef, you might get more of 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid, which is basically that mother compound, and this is a child of it, or sort of C of it like that. Those are in plants, but those are also in animal source foods when animals are grazed on biodiverse pastures. So you're increasing these amounts, and of course it's not that black and white. I mean, if personally, I would not consume a bunch of unfermented beans or something like that, right? High amounts of phytic acid, and for me personally, at least if I consume a bunch of soy products, I don't think it's per se unhealthy, but I do notice that my gut does not agree with it that well, as is eating very high amounts of legumes. I eat legumes, but if I consume legumes for lunch and dinner, then if I do that for a week, then things are not
so good. Well, we're talking about the natural ratio too. Nature knows is going to be my new tagline too. Nature knows. And if you go, and it has its ratios and it has its seasons. And we were talking about right before we recorded the spinach in a shake every morning. I got caught in that. I always say on my podcast, it's like I did that for years, many years ago. And I had tons of issues and skin issues and problems. And it's like, this is not natural. So just because it's good to have some of these secondary compounds in plants and this is rich in this, okay, so then you're like, okay, I'm going to eat a spinach and kale shake with almond milk every day. And then all of a sudden you end up like me with all these problems.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that eating some kale and spinach in the twice a week is a bad thing, right? So it's oftentimes you get trapped in this black and white thinking, whereas the context matters. And also you could argue that no two people are the same, right? Like maybe someone who evolved or grew up on a diet that is very rich in legumes or soy products, right, which would be maybe in Southeast Asia. If we then try to apply that to someone like me who grew up in Northwestern Europe, this is problematic. But on the other hand, I can drink a liter of milk a day and be perfectly fine. Whereas some people who drink milk, right, like, all hell breaks loose in the gut. And so this is also sort of, this individuality piece is also very hard. So what maybe works for me might not work for you and might not work for the other person. I think this is also something that we need to recognize.
That is important. And what I like to recognize, this is a bit controversial topic. I look at these studies and they have studies correlating height and health and protein and their diet on the population level. Not like you can change your height just by you actually cannot be stunted. I mean, it's good to eat enough animal protein so you're not have stunted growth, but it's not going to happen in one generation. But I'm very curious to know your thoughts about this, because you're talking about Asia, and actually they ferment their soy a lot,
Yeah,
right? So it's a lot better. The height of the Asian population is pretty short. It's shortest in the world. It's in Southeast Asia. And then the height where you grew up, tallest in the world, and they're eating the most animal nutrition. And I mean, how did over generations, I think that I talked to the study author, and he wouldn't come on my show. I don't think he speaks great English either, and he didn't want to talk about it. But it's just, how did we get here on a population level?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a very hard question. Yeah. I mean, if you look back at the history, Dutch people weren't that tall in the 1700s. But there was a lot of famine at the time as well. So, and it does seem, if you look throughout history, sort of the idea was that we were at some point very robust near the end of our hunter-gatherer times, right? Mm-hmm. Very tall, strong, and we kind of took a dip when we went into agriculture, and then we've sort of been climbing out of that, and because we have, and maybe now we're going backwards a little bit, you could argue, because we're now, but at least we were, flying pretty high again in arguably the 1900s at some point when we had these very nutrient-dense foods. So yeah, there's probably, I mean, arguably there's a relationship there. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. Drinking milk for generations, did that increase it? Maybe. Yeah.
I mean, something's there. I just want someone to study it more than there's a couple papers on this, and it's 105 countries and men correlated to height and something, and and it's really just this linear relationship between how much animal foods, animal protein, and quality protein they get, and it just goes up. And you can just look at the world map too, and they even have it color graded where around the equator they're eating more plant foods and they're shorter. And in the north, especially, they're eating more animal foods and they're taller. And I don't know what that says, other than I think there's something there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something there. Yeah, you probably want a certain baseline level of animal source food or protein in that regard within your diet, and B vitamins within your diet to grow optimally. But yeah, I mean, this is probably the best that we can do in that area, is sort of this ecological studies, right? Because this probably takes generations to manifest, and you cannot cut Framingham up in one side that you say, well, guys, for the next 150 years, you guys are going to eat meat and milk, and the other group is going to eat like lower quality plant foods. And then you have to wait for generations for those things to appear. And then probably my hypothesis would be is that the ones that are cutting out, and here's becomes also tricky because obviously probably if you consume very high quality plant foods and you supplement that, you can maybe mitigate some of that. But my hypothesis would be is that the ones that are consuming more omnivorous diets, probably stronger and robuster after many generations potentially. Yeah. If the other group at least consumes more lower quality plant foods, because this is another key, right? In Western civilization, we can obviously mitigate a lot of those issues through supplementation and high quality plant foods, and by having isolated or concentrated proteins from plant sources. I still think you're leaving this secondary metabolite issue on the table. This because you simplified the food, but we can probably maybe we can get 80-90% of the way there, so it won't be as dramatic.
Well, we're never going to have the randomized controlled trial, but we can just look at the population level statistics, and I think it's very interesting. So before we wrap up, I just want to, we kind of covered the first time, but you might have more studies on this, and you mentioned a little bit, just the difference that you are looking at these tens of thousands of secondary compounds. You can see that meat raised regeneratively is better than, say, on a monoculture, which is better than a feedlot where they're just eating like soy and corn, and which is better or different than a plant-based meat.
Yeah, so when we talked initially, we were very early innings on that, and we had studied a few farms, commercial farms, where we compared grass-fed versus grain-fed, and we found a benefit there typically for grass-fed. But what we've done since, and this was in collaboration with the Bionutrient Institute, we worked with farmers across the U.S. So these were just commercial ranches. They sent in steaks. And this has been a long project. It's already ongoing for 3 years, and it's complicated to study these things. But generally, what we find is that farms that have more plant diversity, they have more nutrient-dense meats. And animals that are on more monoculture pastures with less diversity, they are a little bit reduced. So let's say if we take, for instance, the omega-6 to 3 ratio, which is sort of this gold standard. Animals that are on biodiverse pastures, they're typically 1-to-1, 2-to-1, around that ratio. When they are on more like monoculture pastures, it creeps up a little bit to about 3-to-1. And then in feedlot beef, it is maybe like 8-to-1, 10-to-1. But I do want to highlight is that grass-fed isn't grass-fed, but grain-fed isn't grain-fed either, because we've also gathered some samples from sort of these, what I call artisanal feedlots or mom and pop feedlots, where people, maybe feed out an animal for 60 days on half corn, half alfalfa for just because this is what their local consumer ones that they sell to. Those fall a lot more intermediate. So they might have a still pretty decent ratio of like 3 or 4, whereas then the grass-fed beef would have 2-to-1, but then feedlot beef has maybe 8-to-1. So you do see this variation across samples quite considerably. And then another thing that we find is that even in grass-fed beef, it's a whole Wild West. So the best grass-fed beef sample is about 5-6 times richer in antioxidants than the best grain-fed beef sample. But the best grain-fed beef sample is still twice as rich as the worst grass-fed beef sample. So it's a Wild West, especially in amongst grass-fed beef. But what we do, our conclusion from that study, and hopefully we'll have 2 papers come out, one about fatty acids and minerals, and the other one's about the phytochemicals. Typically, people that are doing some sort of rotational grazing, or I mean, even if they're doing continuous grazing, if they're grazing biodiverse pastures and do this in a way that does not overgraze, this is probably the key part, you see that you end up with a high quality piece of beef. So many of sort of the North American or American farms that are quote unquote regenerative or do some sort of good land stewardship, you end up with a high quality piece of beef. That is sort of the conclusion.
Well, yeah. And so there's so many reasons to do that. So you're helping support the farmer doing the right practices. You're helping the land, and you're getting more nutrients if you're getting this regeneratively grown beef. So it's my conclusion, which is great, because you, in the beginning, you were talking about the people who just changed their diet from standard American did so much better. That got them 80% of the way there. But then you can also have more improvements, but it's just hard to measure because these are short-term studies, that if you're eating regenerative, you're getting even more. So it's kind of like, do the best you can to get to that whole foods diet. Meat is going to be a lot healthier than any kind of bread or, pasta type of thing. But then but besides from that is just eat the best meat you can afford as well, right?
Yeah, I agree. And this is another sort of whole different field of research, is this idea of like the true cost of food, which is not shown on your food bill, right? And what this means is that maybe it's cheaper on your grocery bill to buy these low quality, ultra processed foods. But as a society, you do pay that cost of producing those foods and the healthcare cost elsewhere, right? Collectively as a society, because cleaning up waterways, soil erosion or remediation, healthcare cost, if those were appearing on and you paid those in tax on your foods, then probably the script might flip, right? Because Whole Foods might then be cheaper. So this is another thing is that, yeah, we don't see this on our grocery bill, but mind you and I as consumers pay for it elsewhere.
That's where the incentives could align differently, or if they can get more in line. I'm not one for taxes and all this kind of regulation, but yeah, if you imagine, okay, well, the grass-fed meat, wow, it's like $12 a pound, just for some ground beef. But if you had like the cheap feedlot stuff and then you added it up, maybe it would be $12 a pound for that if they added in the cost to society, right?
Yeah, potentially.
Theoretically,
yeah.
It's like, oh, well, this $13 a pound or this mac and cheese is actually very expensive because we had to add in all these fees for the problems it causes.
Yeah, for the problems it causes, growing these in monocultures, potential healthcare costs, and things such as that. Yeah, exactly. And this is a whole, and there have been great books written about this from a guy out in Jules Pitty, or Pretty, I think. Yeah, Jules Pretty is his name. He wrote an entire book about this. It's called The True Cost of Food, and it's highly recommended as a read, because he goes into that, how if you were to do that, things would flip for sure, and probably be a benefit to whole foods. But even then, I think the silver lining of it still is that even if you do not have the means to eat grass-fed beef, if you're eating grain-fed beef and you're eating this with a bunch of fruits and vegetables, even if they were grown conventionally, you still are able to improve your health quite a lot. I think you get 80 and 90% of the way there. And then, maybe eating grass-fed beef, which results in a bit higher circulating omega-3 profiles in your blood. Could that be a benefit over 30 years? Maybe. We would never be able to say this with true confidence. But okay, on paper, having a little bit higher levels of that in your blood is a good thing. So it should technically lower your risk of metabolic disease. But the silver lining is that just by eating whole foods, even if it's, conventional carrots and onions and feedlot beef, you're still going to have pretty darn good improvements in your health.
Well, this is a very promising message for most people, because it's great, because meet people where they're at, meet people with their budget. It's because some people, they're like, okay, you have to do regenerative, you have to do all this, and people are just, well, I can't do that. But this is a good message, is that anyone can just switch up what they buy and get into more of this whole foods, get the good, get what they can, and they're going to be very, very healthy because of that.
Yeah, because in a study that we did, and we put people on a regenerative versus conventional diet, which was meant that all foods on the regenerative diet came from regenerative agriculture, everything on the conventional diet came from conventional agriculture. And what we found on that is that if you ate everything from regenerative or conventional agriculture, but most of these people that entered the study were on a standard American diet, everyone got healthier. Mm-hmm. And if you sort of the classic markers that maybe your doctor would look at, which is like lipoprotein profiles, your cholesterol, your HbA1c, your fasting glucose, triglycerides, all of that would become within, would improve similarly. So maybe on your classic blood work panel, you would not be able to pick that up. But okay, maybe less exposure to pesticides, better, higher levels of circulating omega-3s, more antioxidants in your diet. Over 30 years, could that find a benefit? But we're not going to follow them for 30 years.
I think we absolutely will. We have about 90 seconds before the recording stops. But I think the hardest part about the nutrition studies is we're never going to know this 30-year lifetime data. And we have to just go with our gut, to use a little food pun there. And we just know it's better. This is how humans have always lived. This is the foods we've eaten. It's going to be better. And we're never going to see the studies, and it's okay.
Yeah, just eat whole foods.
Oh, I think it's about to run out. We have a time recording. Thanks so much. Let's go hit the Sapien Center, do a little workout, and have a nice dinner again.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.